Today is November 8th, 1996. We're interviewing Eugene Bergman. Janice Sterling will be doing the signing for us. My name is Esther Finder. We're in Bethesda, Maryland, and the language will be English. Today is November 8th, 1996. We're interviewing Eugene Bergman. Janice Sterling will be doing the signing for us. My name is Esther Finder. We're in Bethesda, Maryland, and the language will be English. I want to thank you for doing the interview with us today. Can you tell me, what is your name?
Eugene Bergman. I was born in Poznan, Poland, on September 6th, 1932. No, 1930, which means I'm 66 right now.
What was your name at birth?
Eugeniuzc. My family just called me Gerno. I was given the Hebrew name of Gershon.
Can you tell me about your family, please?
I don't remember very much, but my father was in the German army during the First World War. He came from Village, V-I-L-A-G-E, in northern Poland. From a large family. He had 9 brothers and sisters. My mother was the daughter of a textile merchant manufacturer in Lodz. They got married and moved to Poznan. They were very well off, but had to live in a small slum apartment because of the anti-Semitism and prejudice. My father owned a fabric store. 2 of them, one in Poznan and the other one in Lodz.
Did you have any brothers or sisters?
2 brothers, David and Bronik. David was killed by the Germans in 1944, along with my father. Bronik lives in New York right now. He's 5 years older than me.
Was your other brother also older than you?
David was the oldest. 7 years older than I.
Was your family religiously observant?
In Poland, there was no such thing as Reform Judaism. we were religious, of course.
What traditions did you observe?
Reform, we went to temple on Passover and the New Year. And I sent my children to temple, to religious school, to Sunday school. That's all. That's about it.
When you were a child, what religious observances did your family practice?
Orthodox.
Did you have a favorite holiday?
New Year. Rosh Hashanah.
You had a kosher home?
Yes, I grew up in a kosher home. But my mother did. My mother kept it up. And when after she died, 11 years ago, I stopped.
Did your mother wear a wig? Did your father wear a kippah?
No wig. But my father did wear a yarmulke.
Did you live in a Jewish area?
Yes, in Poznan. It was called Judov's Street, which means Jewish street.
Were most of your friends Jewish?
All of them.
What is your earliest memory?
I remember going to synagogue with other children, marching around with flags. What's the celebration of Simchat Torah, I believe.
Do you remember the beginning of the war?
Yes. Suddenly, one day, the Germans arrived. There was not much change at first, but the next day, they released a list. Freed, yes. The prisoners were freed from the jails. Criminals. For some reason, they saw David and slapped him. My family got scared and sent David away to Lowe's. What else do I remember? Our store was still open, and the German soldier came in and ordered my father to go with him. And my father followed at a distance. and he saw the soldier. I followed at a distance and saw that the soldier kicked my father. They entered a store. My father bought, he made my father buy a big can of ham. The other thing I remember, we lived like by a square, and across the square was a hosiery store. When the Germans arrived, they started to carry everything from that store in boxes of socks to a truck. It was Jewish owned, of course. And then they confiscated my father's store and took some fabrics, bolts, cloth bolts. We took some cloth bolts and hid them in our home. And then the next thing I remember, we were in Lowe's, October or November 1939. We stayed with my mother's family. And the Germans, they established a ghetto and brought, I'll spell that again, N-B-A-L-U-T-Y. The worst section of Lowe's is where they established the ghetto.
How old were you when the war started?
I almost forgot how I lost my hearing. In Poznan, I was standing with a group of Jews. I don't really remember. Some German soldier hit me
The rifle butt.
with the rifle butt on my head. The next thing I know, I woke up 5 days later. I was in a coma for 5 days. When I woke up, I was deaf.
Did you have any other memory loss except for the 5 days of coma?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure of that. I remember very little of my childhood. So maybe you're right.
Again, how old were you when you lost your hearing?
9. To go back to the ghetto in Lowe's where we were.
I don't want to go there yet. Do you remember any anti-Semitism before the war from your Polish neighbors?
some Polish kids would stop us Jewish kids and chase us. That's all I remember.
Would you remember if there were many Jews in Poznan?
It wasn't like Lodz or Warsaw, the Jewish communities. The Jewish community in Poznan was very small.
After you lost your hearing, how were you able to communicate with your family?
Mostly by lip reading them. Sometimes they wrote to me.
And how were they able to understand you?
I could speak to them like I could speak to you now.
How did you get from Poznan to Lodz?
That part I don't remember.
And why did your family go to Lodz?
We read some, after the war, I read some history about Western Poland, and I found that the Germans ordered all the Jews to leave Poznan. Another question about that part?
No, you were telling me before about the formation of the ghetto in Lodz. If you could continue that, that'd be great.
That part I also don't remember, but my brother told me. We had to move to Baruti. We had to sleep 10 to a room. My father took one look at it and decided he wouldn't do that. Oh, and they had a trolley line running through the ghetto for Poles and Germans. So my father told that the family had to leave, and we all went on the trolley. I think we took off our yellow stickers or something, I don't remember, and just left. And then we traveled in the peasant car from Lodz to Warsaw. Crossing the border, what was called the general government, that part of Poland that the Germans didn't annex out. We lived in Warsaw until the Germans established the ghetto there in the fall of 1940. Ordered all the Jews to wear white armbands with blue stars, the blue Star of David. even before then, my father somehow acquired an ID, a passport, a Polish name. Karavzik. He called himself Felix Karavzik. When we moved to the ghetto, he stayed outside in the Aryan section. Interesting. It is interesting. To the outbreak of the war, my father was a merchant, a store owner. He would go to restaurants and play cards once a week. He went to temple. He was a good family man. But the war seemed to have changed him. That Polish ID card was what started was his only way to salvation. Even before that, before he saved us in Lowe's. In the ghetto, from the beginning, it just became worse and worse. People had no food, as most of you know. My father stayed outside in the so-called Aryan section. He would visit us once a week.
What were your living conditions? Where did you live? How many people in a room?
I guess we were more fortunate than most. We had a small apartment to ourselves, thanks to my father. He supported us. He was a food smuggler. He would bring sacks of food once a week into the ghetto. And in the ghetto, food was so scarce. And it was easy for my father to sell it. It was easy for my father to sell it. And he would feed us. We never went hungry.
How did your father get into the ghetto every week?
There were several different ways. For example, there was a guardhouse at Lesnar Street. They had entrances from both, from the ghetto side and from the Aryan section. There were some passages through houses that went through the wall, that went through the ghetto wall. In the ghetto, my brother told me, I don't remember myself, and I was deaf. My father was was known as, in Yiddish, der guten Nen, because he didn't only sell food to, he gave away food to the poor. Of course, discreetly, because if everybody knew about it, they would crowd around him. Yeah, discreetly, people wouldn't crowd around him or crowd around our home. Life in the ghetto was a blur. I remember very few things about it. For example, one day I saw a woman enter a dairy store and come out with a small package of food wrapped in paper. Some man snatched it from her hand and opened it and was eating it. People crowded around him, and he fell to the ground, and they beat him. Food snatchers. I remember people standing on the street. Their limbs were swollen from hunger. I know now. Strange. Also, the street were always, the streets were extremely crowded, probably because the people lived in 10 to a room or something like that. So they couldn't stand it, so they went out.
We're going to have to pause right now to change tape, and we'll continue the story in the ghetto in just one moment. This is tape 2. It is November 8th, 1996, and we're interviewing Eugene Bergman. I wanted to ask you, did your father ever worry about being recognized as a Jew when he came into the ghetto?
How would I know? I was a little boy at that time.
Okay.
I was deaf. I didn't understand what was going on around me.
You just told me about food snatchers. Can you tell me some other things that you saw and you experienced yourself from the ghetto?
One scene I vividly remember. At that time we lived near the wall. One day, in the winter, I saw an old woman bent over, and a German soldier was beating her with his fists. She took out bread and potatoes and put them on the pavement, and he kept hitting her, and she took out the food that was inside her clothes. It was under her kerchief. I don't remember what happened after that. I was lucky. I didn't witness any tortures or anything else except the beating of the old woman. Much later, in 1942, in July, after that fateful July 22nd, which I will never forget, the day the Germans announced deportation to the east. It really meant Treblinka. I happened to be on the street. It was full of people on Lesno Street. It was the main thoroughfare of the ghetto. Suddenly, kind of a Volkswagen kind of a car with Germans in it entered the ghetto. There was a fat German with a red fate who took out his revolver and started shooting at people like they were rabbits. There was panic, and everybody scattered. That's the only thing I remember.
During the time that you were in the ghetto, from 40, 41, and into 42, what did you do during the day?
There was a courtyard in our apartment building. Like in most of Europe, I guess. There was apartment buildings enclosed. There was an enclosed courtyard. And I played with other children my age most of the time. I had a tutor. I didn't go to school because the schools were closed. So a tutor came and he polished. A girl came to tutor me in Polish. Only Polish. She tutored me in Polish. Like Julia Dreyfus. She looked like Julia Dreyfus in Seinfeld. Yeah. They could almost be sisters. My mother paid her for tutoring me. She gave her herring. At that time, it was a delicacy in the ghetto. Other than that, I don't remember much about what happened in the ghetto. There was no electricity. Very foul smell. Carbon lamp. We had carbon lamps. You lit it. It gave off some light, but But it smelled of sulfur, too. But it was better than nothing. My brother David was very intelligent. Very idealistic. In Poznan, he was a member of the Hashomer Hatzair. There's a photo of the Poznan group. We have that big photograph. Very idealistic people. But he was too young to join them. He always looked up to them. I think there's still some left in Israel now.
Was there anything that you had to do as a deaf child to survive that might have been different from what other kids had to do to survive?
Nothing like that in the ghetto. Remember, I lived a very sheltered life. A very sheltered life there. Every time I went out on the street, I could see the terrible things like people dying, a lack of food, and the food snatchers, and the beggars. Somehow, it would float off my back like water off a duck.
Who guarded the ghetto?
There were Germans, there were German guards, Polish police, and Jewish ordered police.
Did some guards work only outside the ghetto and other guards work only inside the ghetto?
As far as I remember. Which do you mean? Polish or German?
Were the Polish or German guards inside the ghetto?
Germans were in the ghetto anytime they wanted to. They were like lords. They could do anything they pleased. People had to take off their caps to them.
Did you witness any raids into the ghetto before the announcement of the deportations?
Not personally. My mother kept me home most of the time.
When you weren't playing with the children in the courtyard, and you weren't with your tutor, but you had to be home, what did you do during those hours?
There were libraries in the ghetto. I used to borrow books and read them. Sometimes 3 books a day, of course, without understanding most of what I read. But I kept reading.
How did things change now after July of 1942?
A big change. all the raids. During all the raids, of course, we stayed home. After July 22nd, for a few days after July 22nd, I remember July 22nd, there was a big red poster in German and Polish and Yiddish, and announced the deportation to the east. So I knew about that. The final hour came. Germans, the Askaris, came to our building. Askari, that's how we call the Ukrainians, Ukrainian and Lithuanian and Latvian. That's what we called them. The Germans, from the Germans. They started to ordered everybody into the courtyard. To bring them to the so-called Umschlag. To bring them to the Umschlag.
The Umschlagplatz, yeah.
Yeah, Umschlagplatz, yeah. I know from reading after the war, my family and I hid ourselves. There was a public toilet in the courtyard with a cellar under it, with the door to the cellar. The Germans somehow missed us. The other thing I remember about July 22nd, our janitor, every house had a janitor. In his spare time, he sold candy in a big cigar box with a string around his neck for about equivalent to maybe 20 cents. Second day after July 22nd, the candy went up in price. One zloty to 5 zlotys. The candy price went up to 5 zlotys. On the third day, it cost 50 zlotys. On the fourth day, you couldn't get it anymore.
Can you describe for me the hiding place, that cellar that you mentioned a moment ago, where you hid from the deportation?
Just an empty room with nothing in it. I just remember that it was under the public toilet. Every day, food became more and more scarce. Finally, about a week after July 22nd, some messenger from my father appeared, and he brought a loaf of bread. Inside the bread was a message from my father. Told us to leave the ghetto, Fast.
Did you or your family have any idea where these Jews were really going?
I asked my brother about that. I didn't know. I really didn't know what was going on around me. The only thing I knew was I was mortally scared of the Germans and German uniforms. My brother, Bronek, escaped 2 or 3 days before us. He went out of the ghetto with a work party. And he was out in the Aryan section, and he escaped. He found my father, and they were together. It left David, my mother, and I. We proceeded to the gate on Lasno Street. David talked to the Jewish police. He passed on something to the Jewish police. It was a thick wad of banknotes. The Jewish policeman talked with the Polish policeman, who started to talk to the German guard. We advanced. The German van read our papers without reading them, and let us outside. We went to my father's home. Interesting. I read after the war that outside the ghetto there was a mob of black M-A-I-L-E-R-S milers.
Blackmailers.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, they were blackmailers. Right. Right. Looking for escaped Jews so they could take them and announce them to the Germans. That's what blackmailer means. For some reason, we passed through unscathed, really. Nobody bothered us. We arrived at the apartment building where my father lived. It was an old, dirty tenement with lots of stairs. My father and my brother lived in one small room. My father, his hair became completely gray almost overnight.
I just wanted to ask one question about the ghetto before we completely leave the Warsaw Ghetto. During the time that you were in the ghetto, did your mother or your brothers have to do any work? Did they work for the Germans?
Of course not. After July 22nd, Jews were forced to work for Germans in the factories, but not before, except Dragons. They were when they were for work parties. There were some work parties. They just picked up people from the street for work parties before July 22nd.
You mentioned that your father was now gray. What happened with your family next?
We couldn't stay long in that room because of the dangers. The neighbors were suspicious of my father and the room, so we left that. My father took us to
Galicia?
Cal.
Oh, where did he go?
Cal, the one.
Oh,
Kiele.
Kielce.
Kielce. Okay, Kielce. It was Eugene Ryan.
It was Eugene.
Ryan. We lived in a small house. It had Jewish owners, but they were gone. There was nothing inside. My father and I went to the street market, went to the street vendors, and they were selling things from the Jewish owners. We bought some pots and pans and some forks that belonged to Jews before. We didn't stay long there. One day, my mother took me to the grocery store. We saw some candy, cheap kind of candy that we didn't have for a long time, so I was fascinated by that. I begged my mother to buy some for me. Other people were in the store and they started to whisper about us. I remember that. It was obvious, maybe, they're Jewish, so it became dangerous for us. My father took us away and brought us to Shostakova.
Do you have any idea why the people would think that you were Jewish?
Because of my behavior, maybe. I was so fascinated with the candy. Remember, I was a little boy. I noticed people were whispering. I think I learned a lesson from that.
I just came up with a question about your early childhood. When you were growing up, what language did you speak in your home?
Polish.
Only Polish.
My parents spoke Yiddish, but I couldn't hear it.
But you communicated with your parents in Polish?
Yes, Polish.
And then you were saying that you went to Częstochowa.
That was another ghetto. It didn't have brick walls around it. Instead, they had fences, wire fences, I think. We thought we were safe. No such thing.
How did you get into the ghetto?
I can't remember that part. We lived in a room in an apartment with some other people. When it happened, the Germans, one day, the Germans came and surrounded the ghetto. Together with the Ascarians. I remember my mother went up to one Ascari with a black, he had a black uniform on. I don't know if he was Ukrainian or Lithuanian or whatever, and offered him a watch. He just looked at it and ignored her.
We have to pause now to change tape. This is tape 3. Today is November 8th, 1996, and we're interviewing Eugene Bergman. You were telling me about the Czestochowa ghetto. Can you tell me what the conditions were like for you, living conditions and the food that was available, whatever you can recall?
Food wasn't really that available because of the fences instead of walls. All I remember, the next thing I remember, it was night. My mother and I we were on the pavement in front of a wall. It's strange because all the other parts of the ghetto were fences, but there was that wall there. I don't know why. Maybe because the other side was a convent, a Catholic convent. David was not with us. The preceding day, he escaped. He took a train to Warsaw to get our father. To this day, I don't understand why he was not caught, because he was alone. He was distinctly Semitic out of all of us. He had a distinctly Semitic appearance. He was terribly afraid of the Germans, I know that. It was extremely heroic on his part to do that. The next night, my father showed up with David on the other side of the wall. That time, my nerves gave out. I was extremely frightened. I didn't know what was happening. I remember I was crying because I wanted to live. The German sentry came, and he shone his flashlight on us. And then the German sentry left. The next thing I know, my mother and I somehow climbed that wall to the other side, where David and my father took us to Warsaw. My father got an apartment for us. 2 rooms, 2-room apartment with a kitchen. 1 room at the far end was occupied by Volksdorf. It was German?
Yeah, Volksdeutsch.
Okay. A small man with a big mustache. He left in the morning, and he would come back in the evening. We stayed in the kitchen all the time. 5 of us. A kitchen that was as big as maybe 10 by 8 feet. I don't know if the folks knew, the Volksdorf knew about us. I don't know, but he just left us alone.
How did your family explain to you the dangers that you were in, the ones that you could not see for yourself, or
They did not. We never discussed it. That was in September 1942. For the next 2 years, we lived in that apartment. My father would go out often. He traveled to Krakow.
Krakow?
He would buy things like spare parts for bicycle, flashlights, and bring them to Warsaw and sell them there. We went out almost every day. I did not look Jewish very much. Somehow, I absorbed the emotions, how to act, so I wouldn't be suspected. I would walk confidently, and I wouldn't look people in the eye. C-R-I-N. Cringing. If you were cringing, you were lost. Some of the Jews were caught in the Aryan part because they were cringing. You can't blame them. After that ordeal of that experience, you can't blame them. I feel very sorry for them. They're not used to that freedom, that normal life. So they were very easy to notice.
When you came back, did you have any idea what was going on inside the ghetto?
And I know that we escaped from we escaped from mortal danger.
Did you ever go in the area of the ghetto to look and see what was happening, or did you have any knowledge at all of what was going on inside the ghetto?
No. But in May 1943, from my window, I can see the flames of the burning ghetto. I knew something was happening, but I didn't know what.
Did you have any awareness that there was an uprising or that the Jews were fighting back in the ghetto? Okay.
Now I do, of course. The fighters defended the honor of the Jewish people. Now, it sounds like a cliche now, but it's very true.
You mentioned that you had to learn how to carry yourself so you would not be identified as a Jew. You would not be cringing or anything like that. Was there anything else that you had to learn to do or learn to not do in order to survive on the streets?
Exactly. I remember I went to Firegrounds. I went to fairgrounds. I went to some fairgrounds. There was a small roller coaster there. There were some some children were playing with some German soldiers. They were surrounded a group of Polish kids about my age. Something told me. I didn't understand them, so they wrote to me. They wrote to me in the sand, in Polish. What is your honey like? What is your... Oh, the Polish kids wrote in the sand in Polish, what is your... It was a Polish word for penis. What is your penis like? I didn't really know what they were talking about. I just said the same as yours. And that was the right answer. So that was lucky for me. I had nothing to do, no school. So I would go out every day and wander through the street. One time, I caught a trolley and stood on the steps outside of the trolley holding on. Some German soldiers stopped the trolley and took me off and slapped me on the behind. And ticket scalper, people go to the movies at that time. They sold out most of the time, so several tickets before, and that early, I would see the people on the street waiting for the movie. There was a gang. I joined a gang. They didn't know I was Jewish, of course.
What name did you use?
Eugenos. Eugen.
Same first name and a different last name?
Yes, yes, exactly. That's how I spent most of the time. I came back to Warsaw. My brother went out. My mother sometimes, and David. Very rarely, because they looked too Jewish. So they would go out in the evening with a scarf around them, a scarf around their face, because it was very dangerous. August 1944, almost 2 years after July 22nd. August, when the Polish uprising started. It was a beautiful summer day. I was swimming in the
Vistula River.
The Vistula River for fun. Suddenly I got cramps in my legs. I was starting to drown. I was flailing in the water. Someone in a boat fished me out. I said something about death that I didn't understand. He was showing me, he was telling me to pull down my pants, to pull down my shorts. I refused. I don't know why. He looked at me and let me go. I got off on the on the quay.
On the quay. Yeah.
On the quay, right. It was empty. Sand had been ripped away, or later I understood. Somebody was shooting at me. I was walking and I saw sand around my feet rising up. I was crossing the street. Suddenly I was surrounded by people with guns. I identified myself. Of course, I said I was Polish, not Jewish. They were Polish insurgents. Their leader was the first name? He used a pseudonym. He used a pseudonym. He used the name of a black person, like a black sheep. He had a beard and a mustache. Maybe that's why. He used the name for black sheep. He was killed soon after. I moved from the riverside to downtown. I saw people carrying piles of wood out of a building, so I didn't know. I just started helping them. So they accepted me, and I became one of them. There was enough food from German stores like Julius, a German food store chain in that area. So we had enough to eat. Interestingly enough, I just read out on the street, the food store chain, Julius, Mayano. They still have that chain in Germany.
Didn't you try to go back to your family?
I couldn't. They were in a part of Warsaw that was German, that Germans held. Germans or the auxiliary unit. Kamieninsky. Butcher. His brigade of cutthroats, and his gang of cutthroats. Several of the Germans. He was not a German. I think he was a Russian or Ukrainian. And his brigade served Germans. They killed and raped. After the war, I learned. I came to the apartment building where my father and David and my mother were inside. My other brother, Bronek, was away. They shot my father and David in the neck. My mother was deported to a labor camp, not concentration camp, because they didn't know she was Jewish. I learned that after the war.
Did you have trouble communicating with the insurgents?
I read some Polish, or we wrote. It continued like that for 2 months, September and October, until
capitulation.
Until capitulation of the insurgents. After the war, I met one of those insurgents. He was Jewish himself. He told me that while I was asleep. They lifted the blanket and found out I was Jewish, but because they didn't know that before. One time, they capitulated. I saw they had joined the civilian population, had left the city with them, or stayed with a Polish company, which was attached like a kind of I was like a messenger boy. I decided it was safer to stay with that company, stay in their company. They they loaded us into freight cars and took us to west. On the way, our train stopped at some Polish station. Some sympathetic Polish people gave us food in our cars. I went to the window, and I had paper. I wrote my name and my address. I don't remember what address I gave, but I know I gave a Polish name. The train finally arrived at a POW camp, and we were marched in long columns, and we marched to the camp. It was called Lambsdorff in Silesia. Later, they moved me, lucky for me, because I read after the war that when the Russians were approaching, the Germans shot all the POWs in that particular camp. The camp. I lived about 2 months, something. Notice how often I say food. And during the war, food was so important. That thick slice of black bread, a little bit of margarine, and that was supposed to be enough for all day, nothing more. I remember everybody was very thin. We were always hungry. There was a French camp next to us. Behind the barbed wire, there was a fence. The French prisoners were well fed. They played soccer. So I hit an idea. I wrote on paper in broken French that to give me bread and that I was hungry. One of the Frenchmen tossed over a whole loaf of bread to me.
How did you learn French?
In the ghetto. I read many books, so I knew about, and I read Tolstoy. I had a good taste from books. I inherited a good taste of books from David. Tolstoy wrote about early 19th century when it was fashionable for Russian nobility to speak in French. So he used many French phrases. And the Polish translation, and then it was translated into Polish at the bottom of the page. That's how I learned broken French. We stayed. I remember Christmas. Some French prisoners came over to visit, us Polish prisoners. They offered me a small plate of beans. I was so hungry. It was part of Polish culture. It's polite to refuse 2 times before you accept. So I declined. But the Frenchman didn't offer to me again. So I was disappointed. Soon after that, the powers that be decided to segregate 50 boys from the adult population. From 9 to 16-year-olds. There were 50 of us.
We're going to pause now to change a tape. This is tape 4. Today is November 8th, 1996, and we're interviewing Eugene Bergman. You were telling me that you were in a camp and they were taking 50 young prisoners out. But before I let you leave this camp, did you work at all while you were in this camp?
We didn't work in the camp. Shortly after Christmas, the Germans decided to pick the 50 youngest boys, including myself, and moved us to a factory in Saxony. And Bruchfisch.
Was it in Braunschweig or something?
Yeah. Near Meissen. It's a famous porcelain city. Yeah, a famous porcelain city. I don't know what the factory did before the war, but when I arrived, they were making airplane parts. They put us to work. They put us to work right away. We lived in a big room with 3 cots or bunks, as you will, stacked, 50 of us. Every day they would accept 5 to work at 6, and you continued to work until 6 that night. And then they put us back in the barracks and locked the door. But because we were no longer POWs, we were civilian laborers. They paid us. They paid us 5 marks a week and let us go out on the weekends to German towns. But there was nothing to buy except some chopped beets. That was it. In January, I stayed there until May. There were 50 of us. As it turned out, 5 were Jews. 4. Yeah. One of them had a strong Semitic face. It's a miracle he survived so long. The others were brothers. They came from 3 crosses, from 3 Cross Square in Warsaw. They would send cigarettes to German soldiers. They were real survivors. Both strong Semitic faces. They had strong survival skills. It's no wonder they survived so long. It's amazing. I was there also. Polish boy soon found out that those other 3, not me. First because they didn't act scared, or they weren't cringing. Secondly, because and I wasn't cringing, and I got food parcels from Poland on the train to Poland, on the POW camp. I put my name on it while on the train to the POW camp. I threw out of the window a paper with my name on it. Some Polish person found it and used to send food packages to me. Just when they started to suspect me, the food parcels proved that I was Polish. The other 3 had a hard time. For entertainment, in the evenings, the Poles they forced the 3 Jews to stand on tables. They would hammer. They would hit them on the feet to say something. They said, "We didn't hear you." Of course, I didn't hear what was going on. They humiliated them. Someone told me, I don't know how I found out. They reported the 3 Jewish boys to the German supervisors.
Nothing happened.
But nothing happened. The Germans continued to use the boys.
What work exactly was he doing there?
I put rivets into airplane parts for the first few months. The last month, there was no work. The factory was closed. So I dug trenches.
Did you have any idea of what was going on in the war at that time?
Some of the German workers befriended me because I knew German, and I wrote them in German, and they would give me newspapers to read. So I learned what was going on about the Russians as they were advancing.
How did you learn German?
I guess I pick up languages naturally. Remember, in Warsaw, there were German, everywhere there were German signs, nur for Deutsche, which means Germans only.
Were there any other languages that you knew that you haven't mentioned yet?
The other languages I learned after the war. At one time, I was in danger. Some Germans, a German foreman saw me with my hands in my pockets. So he got angry. He thought I was a loafer. He called our German supervisor. He ordered me to lay down, and he put a revolver at me. But he didn't shoot. But I saw from his eyes that he didn't mean it. The other dangers that I experienced, the Polish finally found me out too. I think around April. I was sleeping and somebody lifted the blanket and saw that I was circumcised. And then they started to mistreat me too. They would slap me. But even so, I never cringed. So they got tired of me and left me alone.
How long were you there?
From January to May. In May, the Third Reich was collapsing. There was no work in the factory. Finally, we didn't even go to dig ditches. So the supervisor got us together, gave each of us a loaf of bread, some sausage, and told us we were free to go. Just like that. So I went out on the highway. There was a stream of German refugees pushing carts and on bicycles. For some reason, I was scared of Germans, and I approached one German, and I took away his bicycle from him. And he just gave it to me like that. It was their turn to be the coward. The others did the same thing. We bicycled for a day. We stopped near a small German town. I went to a barber shop, and I saw a newspaper that said that Hitler is dead. It must have been somewhere near May. I think near May 8th. I came back to the empty house where a group of us were staying. The boy with the strong Semitic face. He was hurt. He couldn't walk anymore. They were sitting outside the house, and somebody came by, and a man had a bicycle with a strange colored uniform, with a foreign cap, the cap with a red star on it. That's how I knew he was Russian. He was an outrider. He was part of the advance. We all went to the German town. We took whatever we wanted. The Germans were scared. There was a German truck full of French cognac. Some of us started drinking it. And then there was an airplane. There was airplanes overhead, and they bombed the truck, and some of the Poles died. I came back to the house. I was ready to leave and go back to Poland on my bicycle. And that man with that strong Semitic face, I don't remember his name. He begged me to stay with him because everyone else had left. He was alone and he couldn't walk because of his hurt leg. But I refused. Even to this day, I feel guilty about that because I wanted to find my family first. Oddly enough, many years later, I found out he survived. He became a famous music conductor, but I forgot his name. The other two, the other Jewish boys right now, they're in Israel. I joined a group of Polish laborers going back to Poland. On a platform car train. No walls, like a flatbed car. The platforms were full of people. One platform was empty. In the middle of it was a big bed. There was a Russian soldier with a woman on it. I went back to Poland, to Warsaw. I went to the apartment building where we last lived, on the 3rd floor. It was bombed out. I walked down to the 2nd floor. Somebody was living there. So they took me in. They gave me a bath. First time in I don't know how many months. My body was black with dirt. I stayed with some people for about a month or two. One day, I read in a Polish newspaper there was a Jewish committee I left a note telling the people, thanking them for their hospitality, and I left. I said I'm Jewish, and I left. I knocked on the door of the committee, and they opened it. They asked who I was, and I told them I was Jewish. They didn't believe me. They let me in, and they made me take off my pants. I stayed with them. They had a card index file, so I was looking for my mother. Maiden name, Kraganovska. It had there was a card there, and they had an address in Lodz. So they gave me some money for the train, and I went to Lodz. Before I left, one of the secretaries said in Polish to me, addressed me as darling. I cried. I told her nobody has said that to me for years and years. In Lodz, I met my mother, my brother Boronik, and we traveled to Germany, and we stayed in a displaced persons camp until my uncle in New York, one of my father's 9 brothers, sent us a ticket to go to New York.
How long did you stay in Poland after the war, before you left?
From May till the fall, October, something like that. I think it's October. We went to the border between Poland and East Germany. I found a Russian Jewish soldier. He took us in his truck to a camp for refugees in East Germany, with German refugees. Together in the camp, we crossed the border to West Germany. But before that, I had one more adventure. I went out for a walk with a Pole, my brother's friend. Oh, yeah, right, with a Pole, my brother's friend. And the Russians arrested us. They put us in jail. We're talking with some Germans. They interrogated me. An officer with metal teeth. I told him I was deaf. So he slammed the door, and I looked. So he thought I was lying, that I wasn't deaf. So he put me in jail. Yeah, I felt the vibrations of the door close. That's why I turned. In the jail, I wrote a note in Polish and gave it to the soldiers, who gave it to a Russian officer. The note said, "I'm not German, I'm Jewish." What did they know? Half hour later, the officer entered, opened the door, and let me go. So I just walked out. On the way back to the refugee camp, I saw a horse-drawn carriage with my mother in it, and she was just coming to look for me.
Did you and your family at at any time ever think of staying in Poland?
I can't speak for them, but I don't think they did. It just became one big cemetery for Jews.
You mentioned that your father and your other brother had been shot. Do you know why they were shot?
My brother told me after the war that he met a neighbor who witnessed the shooting of my father and David in the neck. He didn't know why, but that Kamenetsky, they would shoot. They would just shoot en masse, and at women too.
When did you start to realize what had happened to the Jews throughout Europe?
It's difficult for me to answer. It was a gradual, it was very gradual. It was a gradual process. When I was in Gallaudet, 1951, a long time ago, I was asked to join a fraternity. I had to undergo hazing first. After hazing, we had to stand in a circle, and the taskmaster would give us various tasks. At one time, he demanded that we all raise our arms in a Nazi salute. The first time I refused, but the second time I realized that it was for fun. They were just doing it for fun, so I did it too.
I want you to explain to me what Gallaudet is.
It's a university for the deaf. It was founded more than 100 years ago.
When did you come to the United States, and where did you first come?
In the Bronx. We lived with two of our uncles. We arrived in 1947. Later we moved to Brooklyn. Varick Street. It was a railroad flat. A kind of apartment with it was called a railroad flat because of the succession of rooms, one behind the other, with the bathroom in the kitchen. A real slum.
What steps did you take to rebuild your life? Did you start going to school in the Bronx?
When I arrived, I was moved to a school for the deaf in White Plains, New York. At that time, it was a military school, and the pupils had to wear uniforms. I hated it. The next semester, I transferred
high school,
to a high school,
high school,
to high school, to a high school in Brooklyn.
We have to pause now to change tapes.